If you walk around MGE and you look at some of our client posters that we have hanging on our walls, you'll notice that about at least 50% of them are a doctor and their spouse. And if I were to estimate, I would say about 50% of the MGE Power client base works with their spouse. Now, the question is this a good idea? I think it is, and these clients think it is, but if you Google the idea, you'll get mixed responses. In a lot of cases, people will tell you not to work with your spouse. Again, like I said, I think it's a good idea, and what I want to cover in this tip is how to make it work. So when you're working with your spouse or a family member, there's a few ground rules that you're going to want to put in place in order to make it work. And just as an aside, I did a much longer version of this as one of our podcasts. It's actually episode 72 if you want to listen to it. It's a half hour of me going into a little bit more of the specifics. This is a quick video tip just to give you some of the bigger bullet points so you can refer back to it. So usually when you see it start to go wrong when someone's working with their spouse, especially if the person they're working with owns the business. So let's say you have a doctor and their husband or wife is going to come work with them. Well, the doc owns the business because they're the doctor, right? But because this person is their spouse, in a sense, they feel like they own the business too. And technically they kind of do, even if they don't own it on paper. So the first thing that you run into a problem with is people tend to confuse the hats that they're wearing in the business, right? Now, it's not just business, because if you look at it in life, we all wear different hats or have different roles. I have certain things that, even in my life, I'm the chief operating officer here. I also own several other businesses. I'm also a dad. I'm also a husband. These are all different roles, and these roles all have different approaches. As a matter of fact, if you look at any role in an organization, it has a couple of components to it. Number one, it has a title. Number two, it has a purpose or a function for that role. Number three, it has duties and responsibilities. And number four, it has an expected outcome. If you have a schedule coordinator, they're called the schedule coordinator. They have a certain purpose or function. They're supposed to keep the schedule full and efficient and productive. And they have certain duties, right? They schedule patients. They handle cancellations. They organize the schedule to make sure that it's effective and productive. And the expected outcome would be production, or a productive, busy schedule. If you look at that job, that's what it is. So every job or role that any of us have in life have those same components to it, whether it's a job that you have or a role that you're doing in your life, a dad or a mom or a brother, etc. So with a family member, it's very important that you have a separation of these hats. Like, for example, I've worked side by side with my spouse, my wife, Sabri, who many of you have seen in tips or heard on the podcast, for over 27 years. And it was funny, early on, you'd start to run into problems because, there's a certain hat or hats that we have at home, husband, wife, mom, dad, and then there are hats that we wear at the office. And when you start to mix those things up, it starts to become a bit of a problem, right? This is where you need specific policy that you're going to follow if you're going to have these hats separated. And I'm not saying you have to take it out and write it all down on paper, whatever, but you have to have some basic agreements. Let me give you an example of a few. The first one is that when you're at work, if you're with your spouse or a family member, you're at work and you're doing the jobs or the roles that you have at work. All right, that's number one. So if you're the owner doctor and your spouse is the office manager, those are your roles at work. And you treat each other just like, the doctor and office manager should treat each other. The doctor can't go, oh, well, this is my husband or wife, so I can treat them horribly just like I treat them at home here at work. Not cool. I mean, you shouldn't be treating them horribly at home anyway, okay? But the bottom line is, you want to treat them as if this is your office manager, and you should be treating them as if this is the owner. Otherwise, a couple of things happen. If you start to treat them negatively, that's obviously going to send a very negative vibe in the office, and you shouldn't be doing that anyway. But if you treat them a little bit too favorably, if you're giving them breaks that you wouldn't give to the other staff, they get resentful of your spouse, all right? So here's the doctor's wife or husband who's the office manager, and the doctor gives them all kinds of breaks that they don't give to the rest of us, and then you'll find they may have trouble listening to that person because they're not all there on the same terms as the rest of them are. As a matter of fact, I don't only work with my spouse, I work with my sister, work with my brother-in-law, I've worked with different family members over the years. I tend to expect more, because that's the other thing that can happen in a business when you start employing family. Family get breaks, whereas the other staff don't. I don't do that. As a matter of fact, I tend to hold them to a higher account than the rest of the staff, and I tend to keep it equal, just because they're a family member, they need to show up and represent the family if they're in the business, do you see? So that's just my own personal viewpoint on it. But the idea is everybody has to be held to the same standard, and when you're at the office, you're the doctor and you're the office manager. Now, the other side of that, and this is something my wife and I adopted years ago, is when we leave work, work stays at work. Okay? We actually made a little bit of a rule. When we drive home from MGE, there's a street about 3 blocks away. The second we cross that street, we don't talk about work anymore. It's over. Because the last thing I want to do, and the last thing she wants to do, is to be laying on the couch or, at 9 o'clock at night, or laying in bed at 10 o'clock at night and be talking about something that's going on at the office, because it's the wrong role. I've seen this. I've had clients who tell me, the wife is the office manager and the husband's the doctor, and they're getting into a fight about some patient or insurance at 11:30 at night after the lights were already off. That's the last thing that you want to do. When you're at work, you're at work. When you're at home, you're at home. Unless there's, an emergency or some type of a problem that you have to address while you're at home, fine. But how often does that actually happen? It happens very infrequently. Now, on the plus side of all this, when you're working with a family member or a spouse, you actually have somebody else there with you that has ultimate skin in the game, especially if it's your spouse. You don't only want the business to succeed wildly, so do they. So this is actually a really good setup, and that's something that I like about it. The last thing I would say about this, as far as making it work with your spouse in the practice or in the office, is make sure before you bring them on, whether it's your spouse or a family member, that they're actually capable of doing the job. Don't just bring them in because they are your spouse or your brother or your sister or your sister-in-law or whomever. Because if they can't do the job, they don't have the basic components, or they're not really fit for the job, you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to need to let them go at some point, which is never fun. But that should also be an understanding when you bring them on. Like, look, if this isn't working out, we're going to have to part ways, but I don't want it to be a big thing. And if you can do that, if you can realize that when I'm at home, this is my job, this is my hat, this is my role, and when I'm at the office, this is my job, my hat, my role, and you can keep those two things separate, it's extremely easy to work with a family member or your spouse. And like I said, when you're working with a family member or spouse, it can bring a ton more responsibility into the business. You have somebody else there who's really your partner in building the business, and it makes it real fun. Anyway, like I said, I get into this more on episode 72 of the podcast, but I wanted to throw a few things out there if you wanted to be thinking with this, or if this is something that you're considering. I think it's super cool. We've had a lot of clients that didn't only come here working with their spouses, but their spouses came in later to work with them because the practice was becoming so successful. It's extremely cool to have a family business like that, and if it's something that's a possibility for you, I would definitely recommend that you try it. Now, if you'd like to find out more about MGE, or if you need help with your practice, you can find out more about us online at mgeonline.com. You can also call us at 800-640-1140. And if you'd like to continue to see tips like this, please subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're made aware when we release a new video. Anyway, guys, have a great week, and we'll see you at the next tip.